The SOCOM officer shifted slightly in her seat, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. She tried to steady her breathing as the hum of the projector filled the silence. She glanced at the papers on the table and noticed that some of them were marked with symbols she did not recognize, yet they seemed important enough that no one was touching them. She wondered if she should reach out and take a closer look, but the feeling of being watched kept her hands frozen on her lap. She heard the soft scrape of a chair across the floor and turned her head slowly, hoping it was just a routine movement, but the movement seemed deliberate, calculated, as if someone was testing her patience or measuring her reaction. She swallowed hard and tried to laugh quietly, but the sound came out more like a whisper of doubt than amusement, and she felt her cheeks burn slightly. She could feel her heartbeat echoing in her ears and tried to focus on anything else: the ceiling, the faint flicker of the lights, the soft hum of the air conditioning, but each small sound seemed amplified, as if the room itself was waiting for something to happen. Her mind started racing through possibilities of what could be going on, who was behind the table at the far end, who had walked in after her, and why the atmosphere felt heavier than any previous briefing. She noticed that the commander at the end of the room was not just sitting there the way others did. The commander seemed to float slightly above the seriousness of the room, observing everything and nothing at the same time. She caught herself staring and quickly looked down at her notes, pretending to review them, but she could not erase the feeling that she was being studied carefully. Every movement measured and recorded. Her fingers tapped nervously against the table as she tried to think of something to say, something clever to break the tension, but the words kept sticking in her throat. She could feel a subtle vibration in the air, like a warning that laughter here might be dangerous. She remembered past missions where she had been confident and unshakable, and wondered why today her confidence felt like a fragile mask. She glanced at her colleagues and tried to read their expressions. Some were tense, others appeared indifferent, but no one dared to make a sound or smile. She realized that something had shifted. Something visible had entered the room and changed the rules. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the dark screen of the projector and barely recognized herself, her eyes wide and alert, her jaw tight, and her mind spinning with scenarios she could barely control. She could feel adrenaline rising and tried to steady it by reminding herself she was trained for high-stress situations, but even the thought of training seemed distant compared to the raw unease in the air. The projector flickered and cast shadows that danced across the walls, creating shapes that seemed almost alive. She felt as though the shadows were moving closer each time she blinked, and her mind conjured shapes and faces that were not really there, but felt real enough to make her stomach tighten. She noticed that someone had moved a small device across the table, and the sound was louder than it should have been, echoing like a signal she did not understand, yet instinctively she knew it meant something. She tried to recall what she knew about every person in the room, about every past mission she had been part of, yet nothing could prepare her for this silence, the weight of anticipation pressing down on her chest. A cold draft brushed her neck and she shivered. She looked around to see if anyone else had noticed, but everyone remained still and quiet, the kind of quiet that fills a room with expectation and dread. She felt her pulse quicken as her eyes kept flicking to the commander. The commander did not speak yet. Their presence seemed to demand attention without words, and she could feel her own confidence slipping away with every second. She noticed a small notebook lying open in front of the commander, with notes that made no sense at first glance, but seemed to hint at things she was not meant to know, yet somehow understood. On an instinctive level, she leaned forward slightly to get a better look, and immediately felt the weight of dozens of unseen eyes pressing down on her back, as if warning her not to. The SOCOM officer tried to remind herself that she was among trained professionals, and that this was normal, that tension was normal, that briefings often carried weight and secrecy, but this felt different. Somehow more personal, more like a test. She felt a knot form in her stomach and tried to shift her thoughts to the mission objectives she had been briefed on before, but the objectives seemed distant and abstract compared to the raw presence of authority in the room. She could feel herself shrinking slightly in her seat, trying to become invisible too. Avoid drawing attention, yet the attention was impossible to escape. She remembered a phrase once told by a senior officer. Always be alert, even when you think nothing is happening, and she realized she had underestimated the room, underestimated the weight of what was about to be revealed. She noticed a pen lying on the table, and absent-mindedly picked it up, spinning it between her fingers as a distraction, but the metallic click of the pen on the table sounded loud enough to startle her own senses. She could feel her ears ringing slightly from the intensity of concentration that filled her mind, every second stretching longer than it should, her thoughts spiraling into what-ifs and possibilities that she could not control. Her colleagues shifted slightly, and she noticed subtle glances being exchanged, some nervous, others wary. She realized that she was not the only one feeling this strange tension. Yet everyone else seemed better at hiding it. She tried to focus on her breathing, imagining herself outside the room in a safe place, but the images of shadows and faces and movements kept creeping back into her mind. She could feel her hands starting to sweat and rub them together in a futile attempt to calm herself. She noticed a cup of coffee in front of someone, and the steam rising from it seemed to form shapes that made her stomach twist with unease. Soft cough broke the silence, and she flinched immediately, but the cough was not directed at her, it seemed casual, but it triggered something deep inside her, a warning signal that she could not identify. She realized that every small sound, every slight movement, carried weight in this room, that nothing was truly as it seemed, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. She looked once more at the commander, and noticed that even the smallest movements seemed deliberate, calculated to test her reactions. She wanted to speak, to break the silence, to make it normal again, but the words felt heavy and dangerous. She knew that something was about to happen, something that would change everything, and she felt the room shrank around her, tightening with anticipation and unease as the shadows flickered and the hum of the projector continued its low, relentless drone. The Special Operations Commander stood silently at the far end of the room, and every eye followed the slow, measured movements of their hands as if they could read the room. Without speaking, the SOCOM officer felt a sudden tightening in her chest, a cold knot that made her palms sweat and her mind race. She tried to appear calm and collected, but every fiber of her being screamed that the room had shifted into a place where mistakes could be fatal. The commander tilted their head slightly, and the sound of a chair creaking somewhere in the back felt like a gunshot. She swallowed hard and tried to focus on breathing evenly, imagining that if she controlled her breath, she could control the chaos inside her mind. The commander finally spoke, and their voice was calm, deliberate, but it carried an authority that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The words were few, but they cut through the tension like a blade, leaving a silence heavier than before. The SOCOM officer felt herself leaning forward without meaning to, absorbing every syllable, every inflection, as if her life depended on it. The other officers sat frozen, their faces impassive, but the subtle tightening of shoulders and the stiff posture betrayed the same underlying unease that she felt. She realized that even the most experienced operatives were not immune to the weight of the room. The commander began outlining a mission that was unlike anything the SOCOM officer had encountered before. It involved layers of secrecy and danger so complex that thinking too far ahead made her head spin. She tried to focus on the facts, but fragments of possibilities flashed in her mind like lightning. Every scenario darker, more dangerous than the last, she noticed. The commander's eyes scanning the room, pausing on each person as if measuring their readiness and commitment, and the gaze landed on her longer than anyone else. She felt a heat rise in her cheeks, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and the stark awareness that her joke earlier had been noticed and now mattered more than she could comprehend. Every detail of the mission seemed designed to unsettle and challenge. She could hear the soft scratching of a pen on paper as someone took notes, the faint hum of electronic equipment, and the low rhythmic tapping of a foot somewhere in the back. She realized that silence here was not empty. It was full of unspoken rules and expectations. She thought about the briefing she had attended in the past and how different this felt, like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a darkness that stretched beyond imagination. The commander paused and let the weight of their words settle over the room like a dense fog. The SOCOM officer felt her stomach twist and tried to imagine herself handling the situation with calm precision, yet the anticipation made her pulse pound, and her thoughts scattered. The officers shifted slightly, sensing that the calm was temporary.